Hi, I'm Miss Bovey.
And I'm Miss Hardy.
And today we're going to be talking about inequality in Eurasia during the classical period.
Yeah, sorry girls, this podcast is not going to be fun for you.
So let's dive straight in and talk about China.
So you cannot talk about China without weaving in their history, this continuity of bureaucracy. So the idea of bureaucracy starts back in our foundationals era with the Zhou dynasty, and we'll see that continued in both the Qin and, more importantly, the Han dynasties in the classical era. So in this time period, we have this idea that bureaucracy is where we're going to find our good government leaders. And during this change of the Zhou dynasty, the Qin and Han, we have that era of warring states where people are trying to figure out, why is there this discord? Why is there this lack of harmony, this lack of continuity with this idea of the dynastic cycle? And from that, we get the rise of Confucianism and legalism, which you should know about. If not, look into them both. But with legalism, it's short-lived. It's a little too harsh. And so with the rise of the Han dynasty, Emperor Wu Di, and this is important, and he's brand new to the key concepts, y'all. So you know they're going to ask a question on Wu Di. So you need to know Emperor Wu Di. Emperor Wu Di will bring in Confucianism to build his bureaucracy on good men with good morals, with a firm foundation in Confucian ideology. And fun facts with Miss Hardy, y'all. One of the key tenets to be a Confucian scholar is a love of the past, a love of history, which only reinforces this idea of continuity with Chinese tradition and why Confucianism is still relevant and seen in China today.
I love that fact. I love that piece of information that really gives you a much clearer picture of why China has been so stable for so long, is that their connection with their past. So to really implement this Confucian system of establishing these officials and the bureaucracy in China, they implemented a rigorous system of civil service examinations where...
Ooh, say that word again.
Civil service examinations.
Woo, might be important. Just as important as Emperor Wu Di.
Absolutely. So ideally, the purpose of all of the system was to find people of merit, people that had the skills necessary to help lead and create this system of stability and order within Chinese society. As Ms. Hardy just explained, because we have this warring states period where it's all this conflict, it only makes sense that they're trying to find a system that would create a stability of order. And so these were really profoundly difficult tests, required a lot of education, and really, although they were trying to find men of merit, it still favored wealthy people, even though you might be smart. So for example, you needed money to pay for an education, and typically schools were only in the larger cities and communities, and so you needed those family connections to sometimes get you to where you needed to go. However, there is the rare circumstance where an entire village would sort of rally behind the really smart kid and support that one student making his way, and there's an example of someone who grew up as a pig farmer who eventually became an advisor to the emperor because he was that smart and took it all seriously. But you can only imagine if your entire village was rooting for you to be successful, how much pressure that must be in order to actually demonstrate that success.
Right. And they had so many different levels to these exams as well. So we had local, regional, provincial. There are all these different levels. So even if you did well on one test, that just meant you go to the next level of tests with all the same people who got the top scores. And then from there, you have to go. There's a lot of pressure. A lot of pressure in the civil service exam.
I'm glad I did not have to measure myself by a standardized test because they are not my strength.
We still have them, but at least they're not 3 days long in some cases.
So over time, this system of civil service examination will become more and more elaborate in China, and we'll see that as we discuss about later empires. But those that actually make it into this system are going to have lots of money, lots of prestige, and high privilege. So you can imagine them in their fancy clothes and riding in their sweet rides in those carriages, that it was clear that these were the top people in Chinese society.
Right. And luckily for the Chinese, even just the idea, even though we know in actuality it's very rare for someone to move up, the idea of that limited social mobility gives the people a belief that this bureaucracy really is based upon good men, and that adds to the stability of it, the idea that they have a chance.
And I think this says a lot still about Chinese philosophy and ideas today about the culture, is the idea that if I work hard enough, I can be successful. Because in their past, there's examples of people who studied hard enough, specifically with education, working hard enough, because you can control your own destiny with that.
Right.
And so the element of education is rooted in this entire system.
Right.
So underneath the officials, and they will eventually take on the title of scholar gentry.
Which is just such a fancy name. If I have to be a bureaucrat, I want to be called a scholar gentry. It's awesome.
Because it says, hey, I'm wicked smart, and also I'm pretty privileged and have that.
Yes, I own land and I do well.
So our second sort of social level within Chinese society will be our landlord class. And in China, wealth meant owning land. And so the early part of the Han Dynasty will really see the rise of large landowning families who sort of suck up smaller farmers that can't afford to pay their taxes or need extra cash. And so essentially this will be a common theme that is repeated throughout Chinese history, small farmers selling out to large landowning farmers. Well, and to be honest, those landlords of the large estates have like all the privileges. They somehow manage to avoid paying taxes, which increases the tax burden for peasants, and they can raise their own militaries and oppose the crown. So Chinese government are not big fans of the landlord class.
Right. I mean, in some cases, some of the peasants owed 2/3 of their crops that they reaped. Was that the right word? Reaped?
Yeah.
I obviously am not a farmer. They owed 2/3 of those crops in taxation, which left very little for them, not only to survive on, but be able to make a living in the local markets. And this is where we're going to see the rise of some peasant revolts, namely the Yellow Turban Revolt. She says slowly, so you know it's important.
So the Yellow Turban Rebellion is really because of the color of the scarf that they would wear around their hair. And peasant rebellions is something that'll come up many times in Chinese history. And as you can imagine, the life of Chinese peasants is not good. They lived in small households, typically large family units within one household. Life was hard. Nature wasn't easy. The landlords didn't make it any simpler. And the state, on top of all of that, required a month's labor every year to work on public works and construction.
What kind of labor is that called? Corvée! Sorry, but you should write that down. It's important.
So anyways, the Yellow Turban Rebellion, essentially at its height, had about 360,000 peasants who were part of this rebellion, and it took place about 184. Really, within a decade or so of this rebellion, the Han Dynasty will collapse. So this is one of those like final stages of its decline. But what they were wanting was essentially this great peace, a golden age of equality and social harmony. And you can imagine why the peasants might be fighting for this, because life was just really terrible for them.
And, you know, one of the others, I know we mentioned earlier legalism and Confucianism as part of these rising philosophies in that warring states period between the Zhou and the Qin and Han. However, there's that third one, which is Taoism. And we don't see that very much in the government because Taoism supports the idea of really not having a government and kind of turning against education. But this idea of harmony kind of beckons back to this idea of Taoism. So Taoism is a part of the reason, the inspiration for this revolt.
The last thing that I want to talk about before we look at our last social class in China is sort of the seedy underside of Confucianism in Chinese history, and that is how the Chinese, or the Han government specifically, sort of manipulated and paid nomads. So they weren't always 100% like held true to some of their tenets for how they were going to work.
What, do you mean humanity is not 100% truthful and honest at all times?
No, and so this idea of creating stability and social order, some of that, like I said, would go into them manipulating the nomadic groups that often threatened their borders, or just outright paying them so that they wouldn't threaten their borders. So now let's talk about merchants, because we all like a little ching-ching.
Well, except for China, who actually doesn't like the merchant class very much at all. They viewed them as greedy in this idea of a social threat. And the government will try to control merchants. However, the merchants are still making money because Chinese goods are considered luxurious, and they have access to both Silk Road trade and they have avenues into the Indian Ocean trade. And so the merchants are still wealthy.
So much?
Well, they were seen as they didn't bring much use to society, and that's really a continuity from legalism, right? That farmers were more important. And so if they were seen as taking advantage of the peasants, overcharging, or even not really contributing to society as a whole, they were just seen as below farmers and below those peasants. However, what's funny is that all the money that merchants make, a lot of it goes into them buying land, to buy into this idea of what the elite in China looked like and what they had. So that way they could buy land, so that way then they could send their children to school to become Confucian scholars. So not even really to become merchants, but so that they could access and gain an entry point into that elite scholar gentry world.
So in order to control the merchant class, because the government so hated them, they weren't allowed to wear silk, own guns. They individually were not allowed to sit for the civil service exam, but as Ms. Hardy just explained, that their children could, because they could be educated. So what the state will end up doing is trying to monopolize other industries to not allow merchants to even make more money. So this is where we're going to see the monopolization of the salt, the iron, and the alcohol industry for the most part in China, so that merchants can't get even more wealthy. But as with all things, people learn to work around the system, and the merchants worked around that system in order to at least make life better for their children if they themselves did not have that benefit.
Right. And that really brings together the idea of Confucianism, man, it is a hard day for Ms. Hardy over here. Confucianism as well, because we see this idea of the 5 relationships, the idea of filial piety. That family unit is so important. And so even if the merchants themselves weren't able to, the fact that they could create a better future for their children, and once their children are there, that sets up a legacy for their entire family line then to have access into this social elite class.
So now as we transition to look at what social orders are like in other parts of Asia during this time period, the biggest place to contrast what's going on in China really will be with India. And in India, it's all about the caste. That is the single most important and most pivotal entity for really Indian history.
So, okay, Ms. Hardy gets a little annoyed sometimes because people call all social hierarchies castes, and that frustrates me because I know a caste system is specific to one religion and one religion only. And what is that religion? Hinduism. And so when we're looking at the idea of the caste system, that is irrevocably intertwined with Hinduism and with which caste you're born into, what jobs you have, where you are in the cycle of reincarnation. All of that goes together.
And one of the things that's really fascinating is that historians don't actually know how the caste system got started. Lots of the time it's attributed to the Aryan invasions into India and sort of the struggle between who was actually going to be on top. And so this is why part of initially for a long time the caste system, there was conflict between are the Brahmins the top of the caste or is it the Kshatriyas? And which is more important. Right now, today, the Brahmins will be the top caste, and over time, that warrior caste will not be at the top. But we can see why this might be a system of conflict. So what are our 4 castes, and what does this mean?
So we have our top caste is the Brahmin caste. So these are religious priests and leaders. Then we have our Kshatriyas, and that's going to be our military, our militaries, our state rulers, so kind of our political leaders. Then you have the Vaisyas, which are really our gilded traders, your merchants, some lower bureaucrats, some lower officials. Then you have your Sudras, and your Sudras are your unskilled workers. And then you have your outcasts, so the pariah, the Harijans, I believe is what it's called.
Also known as the untouchables.
Yeah, the untouchables is really what we would call them today.
Really, like that particular group is completely outside of the system. The system has 4 parts, and they're not a part of that.
Right.
And so much out of the system that the only work really that they're entitled to do is the polluted, the dirty work that is even beneath the lowest of the caste member groups.
Right.
And each of those 4 castes or 4 categories is formed sort of the god of Purusha, and therefore they believe it is eternal and changeless. So essentially the idea is once you're born into a caste, there's no change in that caste, like,
Right.
and you were intended to be born in that caste. And this really ties in with the Hinduism link, which is because of something that you did in a prior life that determined where you were going to be born in this life. And so if I was born a Brahmin, well, obviously you lived a really good last life because you were born in this great caste. And if I was born as an untouchable, you did something real awful in that last life, and there's a lot of lessons you still need to learn.
Right. And a lot of it's built on so many cycles, so many different patterns of being reborn. And so when we're in a Brahmin, it's not just your last life was really good. You're talking about
a pattern of it
through countless reincarnations. And it also ties us into the idea of dharma, which is specifically mentioned in our key concepts for Hinduism. And this is the idea that you're supposed to perform your caste duties to help be reborn into a higher caste in your next life. So that plus karma, the idea of good, everything you do has a kind of universal weight, right? So you have to, what you do puts out good in the world, or what you do puts out bad into the world. And so you want good karma and good dharma. So that way, when you get reborn in your next life, you move up in this caste system.
So, Ms. Hardy, let's talk a little bit about what's the difference between a varna and a jati. Is that how you say it?
I believe so. I say jati or jati. Depends on how much of my Texas accent is coming out. Sorry, everyone. We're trying our very best.
So the varna are those 4 classes we talked about earlier. Now, the jati is really the more nuanced distinguishment within those separate varna. And essentially, your jati is your occupation. So you are born into your caste, and castes are really based on what your jobs are. But there's lots of different jobs, and so those really are a little bit more distinguished in your jati.
We usually call these as guilds, which is important because you can make that comparison when we start getting into the post-classical era. This idea that you have a group of people who are of the same either skilled or unskilled labor set. And so within this, it really is just considered, we sometimes call them sub-castes. So it's just really, if you think about this pyramid of the varna, the forming classes, it's really just the little lines underneath it.
Right.
So just the little levels that are determined by occupation.
And because India's social structure was so controlled and it was so regulated about you never married outside of your varna, and everything was highly regulated with this system, it made centralization of control, political control over India, difficult to maintain, simply because people already took care of themselves. There wasn't a lot of social instability because the communities ran independently of how the government was working, because they worked and functioned so properly as a result of this particular social hierarchy.
Right. And if you're staying with your jati, if you're staying regionally close to the people of your same sub-caste, there's really no appeal to have this idea of an all-powerful unified Indian empire, right? There's not that need,
right?
Which is why power for the most part stays decentralized. The Mauryan Empire, of course, was large. However, the Gupta was much more consolidated in the north, and then it will eventually fall due to that decentralization of power and too many local leaders having too much local control.
Right. All right, so now let's look at one of the other big major topics about social hierarchy or social inequality in the classical era, and that is the use of slavery. And slavery is just not a fun topic. I'm sorry. And there's no beautiful way to sort of describe what's about to go down. But the first model that historians sort of make a connection with slavery is that it's rooted in the idea of domestication and that humans can be tamed like animals. There's some suggestion that women are really the first slaves, and that is rooted in the patriarchal system that we're going to talk about in just a few minutes. And when they're taken as slaves, typically raped and then used as concubines. Right. And then this use of slave labor developed over time as a byproduct of war and continued conquest. And then it just gets more official as time wears on. Now people see the use of using slavery for labor and other sources. Right.
So when we're looking at the idea of ownership and we're looking at the idea of slavery, It's important to note that not all of these empires had equal amounts of slavery.
No.
For instance, in China, it's less than 1% of the population are considered slave. Now, a lot of that can be contributed to the idea of corvée labor. So they already had state-mandated unpaid labor almost as a form of taxation to use to build their public works projects like the Great Wall of China. However, when we look at Greece and Rome, it'll be very popular.
Right.
And so when we're going to kind of compare China and even India, who, though they did have criminals, debtors, war captives, they at least had some protection with the religious laws of Hinduism and Buddhism that we won't see in Greece and Rome.
And to be honest, if you had to look at the most restrained use of slavery in the world during this classical period, it would be India. For example, if a slave woman was raped, the master had to let her go free. That was part of their system. And so there's a little more freedom, and that's why it's the most restrained use of slavery. But really, we need to look at how the greco-roman tradition was using slavery, and it was pretty intense. Right. At its height in Athens, 60,000 people, 1/3 of the population, slaves.
Right. And as we know, Rome will really just conquer or side hug Greece into their empire after the fall of Alexander the Great. Side hug, right? But it is true. I mean, there was not a whole lot of conflict at that acquisition. Side hugged it into their empire, but they'll continue that tradition.
And it's not until the modern slave trade that happens with the European exploration will we get the 30 to 40% of the population being held as slave labor. And this is the one comparison we can begin to make with a more modern era.
Right. And in Rome and Greece, everyone had a slave. So the wealthy had, yes, it was a part of your social status. And so if you were a wealthy Roman, you could own hundreds or thousands of slaves. Even if you were a peasant, you would own a couple of slaves.
Yes, everybody owned slaves. Even former slaves who became free owned slaves.
Right.
That's how pervasive this system was.
So when we would look at this idea of slavery, it is deeply entrenched in Roman society. They had no legal rights. Some were freed. However, you're going to have a lot of slave rebellions, the most notable of which is led by Spartacus, which is funny because they didn't fight for the ending of not the abolition of slavery in the Roman Empire. They fought for their personal freedom.
Yes, just their individual freedom. So it was 70 gladiators that were led by Spartacus, who was a gladiator in about 73 BCE. And at the height of this particular slave rebellion, attracted about 120,000 slaves. And they literally crucified their owners, forced them to fight as gladiators like they'd been forced to fight. But eventually, the strength of the Roman legion just completely overwhelmed them. And 6,000 slaves were crucified, and their bodies hung along the Appian Way, the Roman roads.
Yes, the Roman roads as a deterrent. Literally, as you're going to trade, as you're going to move, you see these decaying, crucified slave bodies as a warning to never do this again.
And we are never going to see it again. I say that never, and then we see it again.
We do. The only absolute in world history is that there are no absolutes.
Right. Will be not until the Haitian Rebellion in 1790 that we see this happening. And of course, the pattern of slavery that happened during this time, the big difference that we're going to see with its reemergence in the more modern era is that anyone could be a slave. So slavery was not based on any ethnic or race-based tradition. They were prisoners of war. These were children that were orphaned. These piracy. There's homegrown slaves. So a slave had a baby, you know, all of these are ways in which you could make slaves.
Right.
Okay, so now we're to the part which you've all been really excited to hear about with social inequality in Eurasia. Ladies, this is all for you.
Here we go. Gender roles in our classical patriarchies. I'm so sorry, but at least we have Sparta to look forward to in this discussion.
Well, let's be honest. More widespread than slavery, we get patriarchy.
Yes,
so, ladies, we've had it worse through history.
Yes.
As we know, the tradition is men were superior to women, sons were always preferred. Essentially, men controlled everything, including the bodies and the reproductive rights of women. And this was the case for all classical civilizations. There is without exception that patriarchy was the force of the day.
Right. The only time we will see egalitarian societies where there's not a little bit of patriarchy are in our Paleolithic hunter-forager societies, and then like the Mongols. That's really the only exceptions to this patriarchal rule, as I slide that little joke in there. So one of the places we'll see patriarchy is in Han China, and this is goes hand in hand with Confucianism. So a part of those 5 relationships, the first is ruler to subject, the second is father to son, the third is older brother to younger brother, then the fourth is husband to wife, and then the fifth is older friend to younger friend. And so even when you look at the 5 relationships, that really is the basis of Confucianism. Women don't come first, and they don't come second, and they don't come third, right? They are fourth below the children. And so we see that happening.
So one of my favorite quotes, a Chinese woman writer and court official, Ban Zhou,
This is important.
Yes. In Lessons for Women, observed that the ancients had practiced 3 customs when a baby girl was born. She was placed below the bed to show that she was lowly and weak, required always to be humble, humble herself before others.
Wait, did they tell her to sit down and be humble? I'm sorry. I'm not that sorry. I'm actually pretty proud of that pun. You're welcome, everybody that's listening.
Then she was given a piece of broken pottery to play with, signifying that her primary duty was to be industrious. And then, if that wasn't bad enough, finally her birth was announced to the ancestors with an offering to indicate that she was responsible for the continuation of ancestor worship in the home.
I remember reading this book about the civil service exam, and it was called China's Examination Hell. And in it, they say if a daughter was born, they would be so heartbroken that it wasn't a son. And it's just so sad to hear. And even the 3 obediences, right? That a woman had to be obedient to first her father, then her husband, and then her son.
Yeah, life wasn't that great. However, the only highlight would be once a woman married and had a son, she held great honor for the family. And then she got to wield even more honor and considerable power in the household as the mother-in-law. So I would not have wanted to have been the wife of the son, because that mother-in-law would have been like, you're not good enough for my boy. Like I have the power. Maybe this is where the tradition of not liking your mother-in-law comes in. I don't know.
I don't know if that's a continuity we can attribute to the Chinese, but.
However, women did have a few things. So women's dowry was considered her own and gave her a little bit of leverage. And women, for the most part, especially peasant women, contributed to the economy of the household and obviously proved their worth, which was a little more complex than the quote that I shared from the book. And then with the collapse of the Han Dynasty, patriarchy will be loosened a bit. And eventually in the Tang Dynasty, we're going to see the emergence of the most powerful Chinese woman in history.
Empress Wu!
Yeah, Empress Wu.
She's fantastic.
So we'll save her for the post-classical period.
Let's just say you could compare her to Theodora in a couple ways. I'm just saying. You don't know who Theodora is yet, but you'll know her when you learn about the Byzantine Empire.
The last thing that I want to point out with China is that with Taoism, women could become priests and nuns. And so a lot of women will sort of take up this as their opportunity to live a very different role than traditional Chinese expectations.
Right. We can compare that with monasticism, with classical Christianity and classical Buddhism. The idea of becoming a nun was a way for a lot of women to escape this idea of patriarchy. Not that these religions weren't also patriarchal, but allows them to kind of escape this societal pressure to be independent in the monasteries and in these.
And they could be educated and learn to write and be productive. And it wasn't about them just producing children and taking care of those in her household. And I probably that would have appealed to me had I been born in one of those societies at that time. All right. So now let's compare 2 societies that are within the same realm, but very different.
Very different. And here's the thing, you guys. There's something I get frustrated with. When people write essays and they talk about Greece and how Greece was super patriarchal or that Greece was egalitarian, I go, you were wrong, because it's only for a certain city-state that holds true. So please be specific in the city-states in Greece, which has patriarchy and which is more egalitarian in nature.
So let's talk about Sparta and Athens.
Okay.
Which one do you want to take?
Oh, you know which one I want to take. I want to take Sparta.
Okay, then let me take Athens. So, as we know, Athens is lauded for its development of democratic principles and the freedom of citizen and like all of these ideas that even today in the United States we aspire to and pay reverence to. But for women, that was completely the opposite. Essentially, women had no legal rights. In fact, if a legal matter got brought against her, she was only referred to as someone's wife or mother. She had to be in the home. They were highly segregated society. She was excluded from public life and subordinate in all way. In fact, Aristotle would go so far as to say that women are so beneath men because they don't produce sperm, and he believed that sperm contained the soul of new human life. And so they were essentially a receptacle only for men and had no other value other than that. And really, so they married in their teens to men that are typically 10, 15, 20 years older, managed the home. The sons could be literate and educated, but the daughters were expected to just weave and take care of household rights. The only bright hope was that a woman could own a little personal property, no land, don't get me wrong, just their dowry, maybe some gifts. The one exception to this rule, actually enough, was the common law wife of Pericles, whose name was Aspasia. And she was not from the Greek city-state of Athens. She was from another Greek city-state, moved to Athens. She grew up in a family that allowed her to be educated, moved to Athens, met Pericles. He was so enamored by this intelligent, articulate, witty woman that they weren't legally married as husband and wife, but they lived together as husband and wife until his death. And she was known to be a rare and remarkable woman.
I always remember hearing about Athens that women, when they were to walk outside, had to have their heads turned down. They weren't even allowed to lift their head to a man unless he asked them or he asked the woman a question, right? Your eyes were to be averted to the ground.
Sounds terrible.
I would trip all the time. So let's talk about Sparta. Sparta is really a shining spot in the classical era in terms of patriarchy. So in Sparta, we do have this idea of equality in marriage. So the women were equal to the men in marriage. Now, I'm going to talk to you a little about the men and what they go through before I get to the women so you can understand the comparison. So when a male child is born, that is a great honor, right? They're going to be powerful Spartan warriors. And at the age of 7, they leave the house, they go into military training.
Until they're 30.
Until they're 30. And it is only after that that they can go into battle, get married, all of that fun stuff. Now, the idea was to become immortalized in battle. In fact, Sparta will often have 2 kings so that one can always go to battle with their subjects. And so, right, we have the movie 300 that only a few of you will have watched now because I am now old. But this movie to kind of demonstrate the idea that Leonidas is going to become immortalized as this, battle-hardened king of Sparta. And so this idea of being a warrior, that is the role of the men. That is their gender role. For the women, however, they go to school as well, but it's more like an extended PE class. It's all about athleticism, and they are considered equals in marriage. And so if a woman dies in childbirth, that is given the same funerary rights as a man who died in battle. Right? So
because they died for their state. Yeah. She died trying to give birth to a Spartan baby.
It's amazing. And even women. So if there is any case of domestic abuse, like the woman was allowed to publicly scar her husband in the face so that he walked around forever with the permanent reminder to everyone of his shame of how he mistreated a woman, a Spartan woman. Now, I'm going to tell you a movie scene right now. So I want you to close your eyes. I want you to go on a picture journey with me. So I want you to picture this King Leonidas, and he is being told news. Basically, this is going to recapture the start of the Persian Wars. So he's being told news that King Xerxes of Persia, who's finally really getting back at Athens for trying to help some Ionian Greeks declare their independence and revolt against Persia, and it wasn't successful. And Xerxes was like, I'm going to remember Athens, don't let me forget. And now he's remembering, so he's going to tell them this ultimatum, and this is the ultimatum the messenger brings. Basically, give up now or be conquered. And so in the movie, I know you've seen this picture on memes before. There is this image of King Leonidas kicking this messenger into this bottomless pit for telling him this message. But if you watch this scene in the movie, before he kicks the guy, he slowly turns to his wife and his eyes say, honey, I'm about to kick this guy into this pit. Do I have your support? And the wife nods her head just a little bit, saying, I'm with you. You do you, boo-boo. And so he kicks him, and into the bottomless pit he falls, as such kind of solidifying Sparta's role in the Persian Wars. Oh, it's just such a good scene.
So what I find sort of ironic about both of these societies, where you have Athens developing democracy and freedom and all of these rights, the role of women is so restricted and backwards, right? And then you have this militaristic society that allows women a much greater prominent role because of her role in helping to create these. But one of the things we didn't talk about is that Sparta can be a militaristic society because they've essentially enslaved the surrounding hinterlands. Yeah, the Helots.
The Helots.
And they have to have a military society because there's more Helots than them, and they might rise up against them at any time.
They might try to get the hell out of there. You're welcome. You are welcome. You're going to get to the AP test and you're going to know what Helots are. You're welcome.
But in the society where they like enslave people, essentially, they support women. And so there's just this weird dichotomy that happens between these two city-states. The other really interesting thing is that Athenian society is more open in regards to homosexuality for both men and women. It's quite normal. Everyone engages in it. It's not a big deal. Where in Sparta, it's not really a thing. And which I find really ironic too, that they are much more open with that sort of ideology. So,
but a lot of that comes down to birthing those Spartan soldiers, right? That's really the main point of Spartan egalitarian-esque society.
So I hope you get a better, clearer picture of what's going on in most of our ancient or classical civilizations, because it's really important to see how all of these sort of connect to each other. So let's review our changes and continuities.
Right. So for this time period, our continuities are the idea of the scholar gentry class. We're going to see that from really now until the fall of the Qing dynasty in 1912. The idea of India's caste system, the idea of slavery, the idea of patriarchy, and how religious and cultural traditions impact these. With our changes, though, we are going to see the conquest, really, of the Persian Empire and how that Hellenization of the East plays a role in affecting their gender roles. The unification of the Mediterranean with the Roman Empire, where we'll see them taking on, we call it that greco-roman society for a reason. They're taking that Hellenized culture.
Then we're going to see the emergence of Buddhism and Christianity as universal religions. And within those religions, women are some of the earliest converts to these religions and allows themselves to have a little bit more rights and freedoms. And that's why we already talked about the monastic system of like perhaps becoming a nun. You'll see changes in social orders because of the development of these religions. And then the classical age will see the collapse of these major dynasties and empires in some of these civilizations. And with those collapse, we'll see the reemergence of some of the same systems in our post-classical era, but you'll also see the emergence of brand new government systems in some regions because they can't sort of reunify again.
So thank you all for listening. We hope you enjoyed it. I'm Miss Hardy.
And I'm Miss Bovey.
Have a great day.